I married a man the entire world thought was a vegetable. For years taking care of him as if he were a living statue, feeding him, bathing him, talking to the absolute silence. And on the exact day I found out I was pregnant, he stood up from his wheelchair, looked me dead in the eyes, and said words that shattered everything I thought I knew about my life. The most powerful man I had ever met had been fooling me since day one. And the worst part? He did it to survive. Just like I did. But before we continue, make sure you hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments, what state or country are you watching this video from? We love knowing how far our stories are reaching. I was 30 years old and already knew all too well what it meant to carry the weight of someone you love on your back. My younger brother, Connor, was always the kind of person the world seemed to test a little too harshly. Too naive, too generous, and dealing with a gambling addiction that grew silently for years, hidden behind smiles and excuses I accepted because it was easier to believe them than to face the truth. When his debt hit $40,000, loan shark money, with interest that doubled every single month, I was still wearing my white nursing scrubs, the smell of the hospital lingering on my clothes and pure exhaustion deep in my bones. There was no easy way out. I made barely enough to pay my rent, put food on the table, and help Connor with the basics. $40,000 was a number that simply didn't exist in my reality. It was my nursing supervisor at the hospital who called me into her office on a Thursday afternoon. I thought I was getting written up. I had clocked in late twice that month because of meetings with Connor's lawyer. But she closed the door, offered me a cup of coffee, and slid a business card across the desk. The name printed in embossed letters was Arthur Sterling. Sterling Enterprises. She spoke carefully, like someone terrified of saying the wrong thing. She told me the Sterling family was looking for a trustworthy woman, someone with a nursing background and a spotless record, for an arranged marriage with the family's eldest son. A man named Julian Sterling, 32 years old, who had suffered a severe emotional collapse after his mother's death and had lived in near absolute silence ever since, entirely unable to interact with the world around him. The word she used was withdrawn. But what I actually heard was, he is treated like a ghost inside his own home. The family needed a wife who knew how to be a caretaker, who wouldn't ask too many questions, and who would accept a highly discreet life inside their estate. In exchange, a lump sum would be paid up front, more than enough to wipe out Connor's debt with plenty left over. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat on the edge of my bed staring at the ceiling, trying to find some other way out, some door I hadn't tried opening yet. There weren't any. I signed the papers a week later. The wedding was a cold affair at City Hall, with no flowers and no tearful witnesses. Just me, Julian, sitting in his wheelchair, staring blankly into space, and two corporate lawyers representing the family. His stepmother, Victoria Sterling, was there. She was a middle-aged woman draped in designer clothes with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She sized me up from head to toe like I was a newly hired maid, which, technically speaking, was exactly what I was. Before we left City Hall, she stepped close to me and spoke in a low voice. It sounded like a shared secret, but it had the freezing edge of an absolute order. She told me my job was to take care of Julian, keep him stable, and never, ever cause problems for the family. That any claim to an inheritance was completely off the table. That I was a temporary solution to a permanent problem. I smiled and didn't say a word. I learned a long time ago that smiling at people who underestimate you is a quiet form of resistance. The Sterling estate was in Greenwich, Connecticut, surrounded by impeccably manicured gardens that brutally contrasted with the heavy, suffocating atmosphere inside the house. It was way too massive to ever feel like a home. The ceilings were vaulted, the hallways were endless, and the silence that lived there had actual physical weight. You could feel it pressing down on your shoulders when you walked. Julian's room was upstairs. When I walked in for the first time, he was sitting by the window with his back to the door, staring down at the grounds. He didn't turn around. He didn't flinch at the sound of my footsteps. He just sat there, completely motionless, like a forgotten sculpture in a closed museum. I unpacked my bags, sat in the armchair in the corner of the room, and watched this man for a long time. He was tall, even seated, you could tell. Broad shoulders, slightly messy dark hair. There was something about his posture that intrigued me right from the start, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Maybe it was the way his hands gripped the armrests of his wheelchair, a little too firmly for someone who supposedly had no awareness of his own body. I brushed it off as my imagination. During those first few weeks, I established a routine. I woke up early, brewed the coffee, and handled his personal care with respect and efficiency, the exact same bedside manner I gave my patients in the ICU. I talked in a low, soothing voice while I worked, even knowing he wouldn't answer. It was a nurse's habit, talking to the people who can't talk back. I told him about the little things. The weather outside. What the chef was making for dinner. A funny story from when I was a kid. I never expected an answer. I just needed the silence to not feel so deafening. Victoria dropped by a few times a week, always armed with a different excuse, checking on Julian's diet, inspecting the room, chatting with the housekeeper. But I knew she was really coming to watch me. Her eyes scanned every corner, every detail, like security cameras disguised as pupils. I learned to act like I didn't notice. A month after my arrival, I went to the doctor for a routine checkup. I had been feeling exhausted way more often than usual, but I chalked it up to the stress of adapting to this new life. The doctor ran some tests, left the room, came back with a very careful look on his face, and handed me the lab results. 8 weeks pregnant. I sat in that freezing clinic chair for almost 10 minutes, completely paralyzed. I tried to mentally reconstruct the impossible. I hadn't been with a man in ages. For years of this marriage had passed with zero contact outside of my daily caretaking duties. Except for one night. A night I had buried in my mind as if it were a fever dream. I caught a cab back to the Greenwich estate in the pouring rain, gripping the piece of paper with my test results so tightly it was crinkling. When I went upstairs to the bedroom, Julian was in his usual spot. The rain was lashing against the glass. The silence was the exact same as always. But this time, when I dropped the paper on the table and let the tears finally fall, the first real tears I had cried since stepping foot in that mansion, something different happened. I heard the sound of wheelchair tires rolling. And then, footsteps. I turned around slowly, terrified of confirming what my eyes were about to see. Julian was standing up. It wasn't a hallucination brought on by my crying, it wasn't my exhaustion playing tricks on me. He was standing, well over 6 feet tall, his shoulders taking up the space of a real, present, fully conscious man. The eyes staring back at me weren't vacant or lost, they were calculating, intense, and loaded with a razor-sharp intelligence that he had managed to hide with terrifying perfection the entire time I had been in that house. My voice vanished. I backed up until my shoulders hit the closet doors. He didn't move toward me right away. He stood perfectly still, watching me, as if measuring exactly how much shock I could handle at once. Then he spoke, and his voice was deep, slightly raspy, like someone who had gone way too long without really using it. He told me he wasn't disabled. That he never was. That this whole thing was a massive charade built entirely to survive inside this family. I stood there listening, the lab results still crushed in my fist, my heart hammering in a rhythm I didn't even recognize. He explained everything with the icy detachment of someone who had been rehearsing these exact words for years. Victoria wasn't his biological mother, she was his father's second wife, a woman who had seized total control of the family business after Julian's real mother vanished when he was 5. With his father fading further into the background, completely under her thumb, Julian realized even as a kid that showing any sign of intelligence or strength would make him a target. When he was 12, he tried to blow the whistle on some financial fraud he had stumbled upon. Victoria immediately had him forcibly committed, heavily sedated, and labeled legally unstable. That was the exact moment he learned the house rule, only the harmless survive. So he learned how to look completely harmless. He created the character of the broken heir, the son destroyed by trauma. And he maintained that life flawlessly for almost 2 decades. As I listened, I felt this bizarre cocktail of pure betrayal and deep understanding that scared me even more than the rage did. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't find the words. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. And then I remembered that night. 2 months prior, I had gotten a text from Connor's loan sharks, the deadline had passed, and the threats were getting violent. I had a quiet, invisible breakdown, the kind that doesn't make a sound but hollows you out completely. I grabbed a bottle of wine from the pantry and drank way more than I should have, sitting alone in the dark bedroom while a nor'easter battered the windows outside. I had a hazy memory of walking over to his wheelchair. Of crying against his lap, desperate for any shred of human warmth in that freezing room. And then there was a dream, a startlingly real dream of strong arms wrapping around me, of heat, of a low voice whispering things I couldn't understand. When I woke up, I was tucked into my bed. He was in his chair. I assumed I had imagined the whole thing. I hadn't imagined a damn thing. The anger hit me then, hot and sharp. I asked him how he could do that and then just pretend absolutely nothing happened. How he could look at me for weeks afterward with that blank, statue-like face while I was carrying something I didn't even know was there. He didn't try to defend himself. He said my question was entirely fair. He said that if I hadn't been so out of my mind with grief that night, he would have stopped it. But that there was something about that specific moment, the pouring rain, my total despair, the suffocating loneliness we both shared, that completely shattered years of his ironclad self-control. It wasn't an excuse. He knew that. He said he had to tell me the truth before I made any rash decisions, because I didn't understand the actual danger we were in. If I tried to pack my bags, if I just walked out the front door holding that pregnancy test, Victoria would find out. And Victoria Sterling would never let a pregnant daughter-in-law simply walk away. There were hidden cameras in every corner of the house. Half the staff were actually on her personal payroll to spy. She had ways of making accidents look like accidents. He pulled out an iPad and showed me the screen. Dozens of little video feeds, covering every inch of the estate, including our bedroom. I stared at the screen and felt the floor drop out from under me. I had been living in a high-security prison for 4 years without even knowing it. He reached into the back of his drawer, pulled out a worn leather notebook, and pressed it into my hands. He said I had every right to hate him for what he'd done, but asked me to read it before I decided anything. I opened the first page with shaking hands. The handwriting was neat, meticulous. Every entry had a date. Month 1, she cried in the bathroom with the shower running so no one would hear her. Month 2, she used her own grocery money to buy her brother's meds and didn't tell a soul. Month 4, she smiled while feeding me with a patience I absolutely do not deserve. Her knuckles were bruised, but she brushed it off with a lightness that felt so genuine it had to be a lie. Every single page was a day of my life that he had quietly documented. I snapped the notebook shut. The tears came back, but they were different this time, messier, deeper. I didn't know what to feel anymore. All I knew was that I was pregnant, that a ruthless, powerful woman was running this house, and that my only possible ally in this entire place was the exact same man who had been lying to my face since day one. Julian watched me for a long time before speaking again. He said it was time to make a move. That he had spent years quietly gathering evidence, building an airtight case, waiting for the perfect opening. And that this baby, our child, was the wild card that flipped the entire board. It gave him a legitimate Sterling heir that Victoria couldn't just ignore or eliminate without causing massive, highly public fallout. He asked me for 6 months. 6 months to tear Victoria's empire down from the inside out. In exchange, he swore he would protect me, protect the baby, and give me real freedom when the dust settled, including a trust fund large enough that I would never have to depend on a single soul ever again. I stood in the middle of that cavernous bedroom, holding his notebook, listening to the rain hammer the glass. I thought about Connor. I thought about the baby. I thought about the 4 years I had sacrificed to this house, completely blind to the war raging around me. And then I said yes. Not because I fully trusted him yet, but because there was literally no other way out. Life inside the mansion went on looking exactly the same to anyone watching. Julian was back in his wheelchair every morning before the staff knocked on the door. I resumed my caretaking routine with the exact same demeanor, efficient, quiet, invisible. The charade ticked on like a Swiss watch, but my role had completely shifted. I wasn't just the nursewife anymore. I was a co-conspirator in a plot I didn't fully understand yet. At night, once the heavy drapes were pulled shut and the hidden cameras were jammed by a little device Julian kept stashed behind a false panel in the mirror, he took off the mask. Not literally, but the transformation was so intense it felt like it. The tension melted out of his jaw, his eyes snapped into focus, his posture broadened. He turned into a man I barely recognized. Living together was weird. There was no fake intimacy, no forced romance. We were just 2 adults navigating an insane situation with the tight, polite tension of 2 people who know they need each other to stay alive. He slept on the oversized sofa in the sitting area of our room. I took the king-sized bed. We never argued about it, it was just the way things were. But sometimes, the nights broke protocol in ways I didn't expect. One night, I woke up around 2 a.m. dying of thirst and saw a soft glow coming from the makeshift office he'd set up in the corner. I crept over quietly and peeked through the cracked door. He was hunched over his laptop, his fingers flying across the keyboard with a terrifying level of focus I'd never seen on anyone's face. And sitting right next to his mousepad was a plate. Steak and roasted vegetables. Real food. I walked in without thinking. He jumped hard, the involuntary flinch of someone caught doing something highly illegal. There was a thick, awkward silence. Then, looking incredibly uncomfortable, he slid the plate across the desk toward me. He confessed that the night shift security guard smuggled him takeout. For years, he had been pretending to swallow the bland oatmeal I made him every morning. He'd secretly dump it into the massive potted plant out of the camera's view, and then he would eat actual meals at 3 a.m. I ate half his steak right there, standing in silence at 2 in the morning, inside one of the most ridiculously expensive rooms I'd ever been in. It was one of the most absurd and strangely honest moments of my entire life. It was also during this time that I discovered just how lethal this house really was. There was an older housekeeper named Martha who had been with the family for over 15 years. Soft-spoken, polite, always hovering just out of sight. Every single night, she would bring up a mug of herbal nighttime tea, claiming it was an old family recipe to strengthen Julian's immune system, and hand it to me to feed him. On the 3rd night of our new arrangement, Julian stopped me with a tiny hand gesture just before I brought the mug to his lips. Once Martha's footsteps faded down the hall, he took the mug and walked over to the potted fern. He poured the entire thing into the soil. The next morning, he pointed to the plant. The bright green leaves at the base had turned sickly yellow and started shriveling. The tea was laced with a liquid sedative. It was a microdose, not enough to kill you, but taken every night for months and years, it was enough to fog the brain, destroy cognitive function, and turn a brilliant man into someone sluggish and totally confused. Victoria had been chemically lobotomizing him for years. And he had been pretending to drink it, spitting it into a hidden towel, because he knew that fighting back would mean signing his own death warrant. I sat heavily on the edge of the bed, feeling sick to my stomach. I looked at this man, who had spent 32 years fighting a brutal, invisible war, and for the very first time, I felt something other than fear or suspicion. I felt a sharp, aching empathy. The kind you only feel when you recognize a profound loneliness in someone that mirrors your own. I asked him why he chose me. Out of all the women Victoria could have picked, why did he approve me? He was quiet for a second. Then he said he specifically requested someone with a medical background. That part was real. He needed someone who knew how to handle a patient without drawing suspicion. But what he hadn't planned on was that I was the kind of person who talked to someone who couldn't answer. That I didn't treat a broken man like he was less than human. He said he hadn't felt human in that house for years. And I had given that back to him without even trying. I didn't say anything back. I just stared at the rain lashing the window, at the dark, sprawling grounds of this estate that was basically an invisible cage. I thought about the baby growing inside me, still tiny, still quiet, completely unaware of the absolute snake pit it had been conceived in. I put my hand on my stomach and made a silent vow. This kid is not going to grow up in a war zone of lies. I was going to find a real way out, even if I had to tear this mansion down brick by brick. And nobody, not Victoria, not the hidden cameras, not all the Sterling money in the world, was going to stop me. Connor showed up unannounced on a Sunday morning. He had just checked out of a private rehab facility where he'd spent the last 6 months, a program Julian had fully paid for without me asking, without bragging about it, and without holding it over my head. I only found out when Connor walked up to the front door looking healthier, with clearer eyes than I had seen in him for a decade. He squeezed me tight in the foyer, cried a little, promised me he was good, that he was getting a fresh start, that he was done letting me down. I hugged him back, feeling that overwhelming mix of unconditional love and bone-deep exhaustion that only caretakers understand. Then he walked into the living room to say hi to Julian. And right there, in the middle of the Sterling Grand Parlor, I witnessed the most unsettling yet strangely beautiful scene since I moved in. Julian was in his wheelchair, playing his part flawlessly, eyes glazed over, jaw slack, head tilted slightly to the side. Connor walked up, knelt down so they were eye level, and thanked him with a sincerity that was completely unscripted. He said he knew Julian couldn't really understand what he was saying, but he wanted to say it anyway. That Julian's family had done more to save his life than anyone else ever had. In response, Julian slowly lifted his hand with a highly convincing tremor, and pointed a shaking finger at the fruit bowl on the coffee table. The universal gesture for, eat something, you look hungry. Connor's eyes welled up. He looked up at me and whispered that Julian had a beautiful soul. That I was lucky to have married a man with such a pure heart. Every word my brother said felt like a tiny needle poking into my conscience. Because I knew the truth. Because the beautiful soul Connor saw was both entirely real and a complete fabrication at the exact same time, blended together so tightly I didn't even know how to separate them anymore. Later that afternoon, after Connor left, Julian stood up from his chair and stared out the window. Without turning around, he said, "Your brother is a good man." It wasn't a judgment, it was just a quiet, factual observation. I said yes, he is. And that was exactly why I couldn't afford to screw this up. Over the next few weeks, Julian started letting me in on the game plan. Not the granular details, he was way too paranoid for that, but enough pieces for me to see the full puzzle. He was gathering wire transfers, offshore accounts, proof that Victoria was systematically draining Sterling Enterprises, medical logs proving she was over-medicating his father, a man who rarely left his wing of the house and just blindly signed whatever papers Victoria shoved in front of him. His father. That was the messiest part of this whole thing. I'd only seen Arthur Sterling a handful of times, a hunched, graying man in his 60s who always looked like he was apologizing for taking up space. Victoria paraded him around publicly like a trophy, but treated him like a dog behind closed doors. He was a man who had let himself be completely erased over the years. I recognized the symptoms, I'd seen it in terminal patients. Except this guy wasn't dying of a disease. He was dying of apathy. Julian told me late one night that his dad used to be a force of nature, that there were good memories buried under the decades of Victoria's reign. But his father's ambition was ruthless back in the day, and Victoria had taken his old, dirty corporate secrets and turned them into blackmail to put a leash on him. There were no white knights in this story. Just highly damaged people hurting each other in a chain reaction that started decades ago. It was right around this time that Audrey cornered me. She ambushed me in the hospital lobby after my shift, a stunning, polished woman with the kind of posture that comes from old money. Perfect blowout, designer coat, wearing a perfume that announced her presence before she even spoke. She smiled a razor-thin smile and said my name like we were old sorority sisters. She introduced herself as Julian's ex-fiancée. From 10 years ago, right before his collapse. I agreed to grab coffee with her down the street because my curiosity completely overrode my common sense. She didn't mince words. She leaned across the table and told me she knew Julian was faking it, that she had figured out his act years ago, and that was why she called off the wedding. She refused to spend her life shackled to a man whose only survival strategy was a pathological lie. And then she dropped the bomb. She said Julian picked me specifically because I was broke, desperate, and just compliant enough to play nurse without asking questions. Her words hit like a gut punch because I knew they were at least partially true. But there was a layer Audrey couldn't see, or refused to. Because being picked out of desperation didn't mean I was just a pawn. And that leather notebook with 4 years of daily entries wasn't the diary of a man who just saw me as a tool. I took an Uber back to the estate that afternoon feeling incredibly heavy. I stood outside our bedroom door for 5 full minutes before turning the handle. When I walked in, I threw a single question at him. No warm-up, no sugarcoating. I asked him if I was just a useful idiot in his grand master plan, or if any piece of this was actually real. He sat there in dead silence. For a long time. Then he rolled over to the window, turned his back to me, and said absolutely nothing. That silence was the single cruelest thing he had done to me since we met. Crueler than the 4 years of pretending to be brain dead. Because it was a silence I didn't know how to translate, and he knew it. I walked out of the room without another word. I lay in bed for hours, staring at the ceiling, thinking Audrey was probably right. That I was exactly what she said I was, a naive girl who bet her entire life on a poker hand she couldn't even see. Around 2 a.m., the bedroom door clicked open. He walked in completely silently, sat on the edge of my mattress, and pressed something cold into my palm. It was his iPhone. Unlocked. I opened the photo gallery with shaking thumbs. There were hundreds of pictures. Maybe more. The oldest one was from my first week at the house, a shot of my back as I was mopping the hardwood floor, my shoulders slumped in total defeat. It was taken from a low angle. The angle of someone sitting in a wheelchair. He had been taking photos of me for years, right to my face, while I was treating him like a vegetable. I swiped through them. A photo of me passed out with my head resting on his armrest, dead tired after pulling a double shift at the hospital. A picture of me laughing at a late-night Jimmy Fallon clip on my phone when I thought everyone was asleep. A shot of me sitting on the kitchen floor on the anniversary of my parents' death, a date I had literally never mentioned to a single soul in that house. Every single photo had a timestamp, and a tiny caption typed into the Notes app. She actually laughed today. She didn't look so crushed by the world. I wish to God I could have laughed with her. She made chicken soup today. Tasted exactly like she said her moms used to. She's pretending she isn't crying. She's running on fumes. Worked a 16-hour shift and still came home to bathe me without a single complaint. I have no idea how her spine hasn't snapped under the weight she carries. My throat closed up tighter with every swipe. Julian was sitting next to me, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor rug. When I finally finished and looked up at him, his face looked totally different. For the first time in our entire marriage, his armor was completely gone. He admitted that in the beginning, Audrey was exactly right. I was a calculated heir. A necessary pawn. Someone who would do the job without blowing his cover. But at some point, he couldn't even pinpoint exactly when, I stopped being a pawn. He told me he had spent 32 years pretending he didn't exist just so he wouldn't be destroyed. And that when I walked into his room and talked to him like a real human being, when I didn't let his silence make him invisible, it was the first time in his entire adult life he actually felt alive. He said he didn't know if it was love. He literally used those exact words, with that brutally awkward honesty of his. He said nobody had ever taught him how love was supposed to function, so he didn't know what to call it. But he knew for a fact that he could not picture this house, his future, or his survival without me in it. And his silence earlier that afternoon? He said it wasn't indifference. It was just the very first time his brain completely short-circuited. For a guy who had spent 2 decades meticulously calculating every single syllable he spoke, having 0 words was the biggest confession he could possibly make. I looked at him for a long time. I didn't tell him I loved him back. It wasn't the time for that, and I refused to fake something that big. But I told him I was in his corner. 6 months was 6 months, and I was going to see this through to the end. He nodded. And sitting there in the dark at 2 a.m., a totally different kind of silence settled over us. The good kind. The kind that fits. The plan shifted into overdrive over the next few weeks. Julian was securely messaging his outside allies using encrypted networks Victoria couldn't trace. An old-money corporate lawyer who used to work for Julian's grandfather. A fired whistleblower accountant sitting on a mountain of shredded tax documents. An investigative journalist from Wall Street who Victoria had buried in lawsuits years ago. I played my part flawlessly, I stayed invisible. I was the mousy, unambitious nursewife who kept her head down when Victoria swept into the room, smiling just enough to be boring. I was a pro at this. Nursing teaches you how to completely neutralize your facial expressions during a crisis. But there was a wild card we hadn't accounted for. Martha, the housekeeper, started watching me differently. It wasn't glaringly obvious. It was the way she'd linger in the doorway for an extra 3 seconds. The way her eyes darted around the bedroom when she thought I was reading. She started bringing the tea up at random, unpredictable times, testing us to see if we'd slip up. I warned Julian. He wasn't surprised. He said Victoria had definitely ordered Martha to look for any microscopic shifts in my behavior, my routine, or my mood. We had to be flawless. Right around then, Connor called me with news that spiked my blood pressure. He had just gotten hired at a private investigation firm in the city. He was grinding to pay off his remaining debts and get his life totally straight. I was proud of him, but it terrified me. Connor was too soft-hearted for a cutthroat PI job. But I also realized he now had access to the exact kind of databases we were going to need. Keep him on speed dial, I told myself. You're going to need him. Meanwhile, the baby was getting bigger. I was starting to show, and wearing oversized sweaters was losing its effectiveness. One afternoon, Victoria walked past me in the hall and dropped a casual, razor-sharp comment about how a pregnancy could really complicate the living situation for a girl in my position. I just smiled and told her I was feeling fantastic. Internally, I received the threat loud and clear. She was telling me this kid was a liability. And in the Sterling family, liabilities get removed. I told Julian about the encounter that night, shockingly calm. He closed his laptop, sat perfectly still for a second, and said it was time to pull the trigger. There was no more time to wait for the perfect alignment of the stars. We were in the endgame. The Sterling Enterprises annual shareholders board meeting was set for a Thursday morning at their Manhattan headquarters. Julian was awake before the sun came up. When I walked out of the bathroom, he was already standing in front of the full-length mirror, adjusting the collar of a custom-tailored charcoal suit I had never seen before. He looked like an absolute predator. There was zero trace of the broken man who lived in the wheelchair. We caught each other's eyes in the mirror. We didn't need to say anything. He insisted I come with him. He said the heir's wife wasn't going to hide in the shadows today, that my being there was part of the optics, part of the legitimacy he was bringing to the boardroom. I didn't argue. I was pregnant, exhausted, and running on pure adrenaline that had totally burned away my fear. We pulled up to the glass skyscraper in a black town car, and Julian was wheeled through the lobby doors, the absolute last time he would ever use that chair. The massive glass boardroom was packed. Board members, C-suite executives, corporate sharks. Victoria was holding court at the head of the mahogany table, looking incredibly smug. She had drafted a legal injunction, signed by a shady doctor she had on payroll, declaring Julian fully legally incompetent and permanently transferring 100% of his voting shares to her. Her lawyer stood up and started reading the injunction out loud to the room. And then, Julian stood up. The silence that sucked the air out of that boardroom was the kind you feel in your teeth. Every single billionaire in that room froze in different states of shock, panic, or utter confusion, depending on whose payroll they were on. Julian straightened his suit jacket, calmly walked to the front of the room, and looked down at Victoria. The look in his eyes was apocalyptic. He announced to the room that his health was fantastic, that it always had been. He loudly thanked his stepmother for babysitting his assets while he was grieving his mother, but informed the board that as of this morning, he was taking the wheel. He snapped his fingers at the tech guy, and the massive projector screen lit up. What happened next was a corporate bloodbath. Offshore bank statements, audio recordings, forged signatures. Every slide was a smoking gun proving how Victoria had been embezzling from the company, blackmailing executives, and forging SEC documents. She thought she had built an empire, but she had left fingerprints on every single brick. I watched from the back wall, holding my stomach. Right as slide 4 went up, the baby kicked. Hard. A little, quiet riot inside of me. It felt like applause. Victoria tried to scream. She tried to spin it. She tried to command the room with the iron fist she had used for 20 years. But there was no sedative laced tea here. There was no crippled boy to lock in a psych ward. There was just cold, hard federal evidence broadcast on a 100-inch screen. Building security physically dragged her out of the room while she was still screaming threats. In the chaos of executives scrambling to call their lawyers, Julian caught my eye from across the room. The look on his face wasn't triumph or arrogance. It was pure, unadulterated shock. Like a man who had been swimming in the dark for 20 years and finally felt his feet hit the sand. The board scrambled to save themselves, papers were hastily signed, and Julian Sterling was officially reinstated as the majority shareholder and CEO of his own empire. We rode back to Connecticut in total silence. It was 3 in the afternoon, and the Manhattan skyline was glowing in that golden hour light that feels almost too cinematic to be real. He reached over and grabbed my hand. He didn't say a word. He just held it the entire drive home. That night, Julian's father called me into his private study. Arthur Sterling looked smaller than ever. He slid a thick manila envelope across his leather desk. Inside were legal transfer documents. He was gifting a massive chunk of his personal stock portfolio directly to me, in my name. He croaked out that it was an apology. That he saw what went down in that boardroom, and he knew that his own cowardice was just as responsible for Julian's stolen life as Victoria's malice was. He had chosen money over his son for 20 years. He told me he needed me to be Julian's anchor. That Julian was a genius, but geniuses can be dangerously cold. He needed a wife with a spine of steel who wouldn't let him turn into a monster. I picked up the Montblanc pen and signed the papers without a shake in my hand. But as the ink dried, I realized this piece of paper was a loaded gun. It was insane wealth, but it was also a heavy crown. It was the price tag of our trauma, converted into stock options. Connor called my cell phone an hour later. He had been digging through the PI firm's cold cases, and what he found about Martha the housekeeper blew the entire Sterling family history wide open. Martha wasn't just a loyal maid. She was the sister of a Sterling family chauffeur who had died in a highly suspicious car crash 30 years ago, a crash Arthur Sterling had aggressively covered up. Martha had been playing the ultimate long game. She infiltrated the staff and waited decades to poison the family from the inside out. And the biggest bombshell? Julian's biological mother, who supposedly died in that exact same car crash, never actually died. She was alive. She had spent 24 years locked inside a high-end, private psychiatric facility in upstate New York. Victoria had faked her death, bribed the right doctors, and had her locked in a padded room. And Victoria had specifically planted Martha as the middleman to ensure the mother was tortured with isolation every single day. When I told Julian, he froze in the center of our bedroom. Perfectly still, just like his wheelchair days, but this wasn't an act. This was a man whose entire universe had just violently snapped in half. We drove upstate that same night. Torrential rain, pitch-black highways, navigating blindly toward an address Connor had pulled from a sealed police file. The facility was a sterile, sprawling white compound nestled in the woods. Julian didn't stop at the security gate. He blew right through it, walked into the lobby looking like the Grim Reaper in a tailored suit, and nobody on staff had the guts to ask for his ID. Room 402. The very end of the hall. When he shoved the door open, there was a frail woman sitting on a stark white bed, her knees pulled tight to her chest. She had gone prematurely gray, her skin paper-white from lack of sun. She flinched violently when the door hit the wall, the flinch of someone who knows that opening doors only ever brings pain. Julian stopped dead in his tracks. Then his voice cracked. "Mom?" She slowly looked up. At first, it was pure terror. Then utter confusion. And then, fighting through 2 decades of chemical fog, a spark of recognition lit up in her eyes. She reached out a trembling hand and touched his jawline like she was terrified he was a ghost. Julian fell to his knees on the linoleum floor and completely broke down. I stood in the hallway. Some moments are too sacred to intrude on. But as I backed up, I saw Martha stepping out of the elevator. She had driven up behind us. The look on her face wasn't the look of a panicked employee, it was the look of a woman who had spent 30 years praying for this exact moment of agony. She had wanted Julian's mother to rot. She wanted this reunion to never happen. But it did. Martha was in handcuffs before midnight. Connor had faxed the mountain of evidence to the state police an hour before we even arrived. Victoria Sterling was arrested at JFK Airport 3 days later, trying to board a private jet to the Caymans with 2 duffel bags stuffed with untraceable bearer bonds. Arthur Sterling quietly resigned from the board to keep the FBI from digging deeper into his past. Julian let him walk away, not out of mercy, but because there was a tiny, fractured piece of Julian that still remembered when his dad was a hero. We moved Julian's mother to a gorgeous, sunlit rehabilitation estate overlooking the ocean. It took time. You don't just magically bounce back from 24 years in a psych ward. But the good days slowly started outnumbering the bad ones. I became her anchor during that transition. I'd sit on the porch with her, brush her hair, and just share the quiet air when she couldn't handle words. It was what I was good at, healing broken things without rushing the process. One afternoon, she reached out, put her hand over my massive pregnant belly, and gave me the most genuinely beautiful smile I had ever seen. The delivery was brutal. Julian paced the waiting room in a state of absolute, manic panic, the only time I've ever seen him lose total control. When the doctor finally came out and told him we were both healthy, Julian barged into the delivery room without a shirt on. He had spilled hot coffee all over his dress shirt and literally ripped a scrub top off an intern in the hallway. He looked at me, and the relief washing over his face was almost painful to witness. We named him Asher. It means a blessing, a fresh start. The years after that weren't a fairy tale. Julian had to unlearn a lot of toxic survival traits. He had to learn that controlling everything isn't the same thing as trusting someone. That loving your wife doesn't mean building a fortress around her, sometimes it means letting her fight her own battles, even when it terrifies you. We figured it out together, stumbling through the messy, normal life that neither of us had any practice living. We had fights, and awkward silences, and nights where we just needed to sleep in different rooms to breathe. But we also had the mornings. He completely stepped back from running the company, handing the reins to a trusted board, and built a massive greenhouse in our backyard by hand. He grew heirloom roses with a ridiculous amount of patience. He tied my sneakers for me when my back hurt, acting like it was the most important job in the world. Sitting on the wraparound porch of a house that finally actually felt like a home, watching my billionaire husband prune rose bushes in muddy boots, I thought about that freezing day at City Hall. The cheap white scrubs, the bone-deep exhaustion, the contract I signed without having a clue what I was stepping into. I realized that if someone handed me a time machine, even knowing the absolute hell we went through, I wouldn't change a single thing. Because the pain was agonizingly real. But the freedom on the other side was real, too. And caught in the middle of it all was 4 years of lies, a beautiful little boy, a mother brought back from the dead, a brother who finally got clean, and a man who learned that just surviving in silence isn't the same thing as actually living. Life has a funny way of balancing the scales, even when it feels like you're drowning. You can only see the masterpiece when you finally step back. We still have a long road ahead. And I know it's going to storm again eventually. But I also know that when I look over, he's going to be standing right there, not because he needs a pawn, not because I'm a useful idiot, but because he chooses to be. And I choose him back. Now, if you like this story, click subscribe, and tell me in the comments which part made your jaw drop. Oh, and don't forget to become a member for access to exclusive videos I don't post here. See you there.